Robert Buckland, the former Justice Secretary and the MP for South Swindon, joins me now. Thank you for coming in, Sir Robert. Lovely to see you. Look, it's been a very difficult week, hasn't it been? Subjected to, frankly, the angst and agony of the families of the victims of Valdo Calocane. There are questions to be answered here in this case. My first question to you as a former Justice Secretary is, how was this guy free to roam the streets? We understand he was under an arrest warrant from September 2022. The police couldn't find him, even though the victim's family say that he had a registered address in Nottingham, for 6 months before he was evicted on June the 11th, carried out the killings on June the 13th. He wasn't taking his antipsychotic medication and apparently was being unmonitored while he was doing it. How do cases like this happen?
Yes, well, there are two things there. There's the NHS and the involvement of local services in monitoring this person for his mental health condition, and then the warrant that had been issued some months before for the police to collect him and bring him in. And it does seem that from the time that he was in a secure hospital back in 2020, from his release, there doesn't seem to have been an intermediate way to deal with this individual. No medication. Clearly unresolved, serious mental health issues. I'm afraid I've described this person by the time we get to June as a killing machine. He was going to kill and hurt people, and it's an unutterable tragedy that two young, beautiful lives have been lost. A public servant, caretaker, murdered, and then 3 people having life-changing injuries. All that has to add up to a very serious set of questions about why it is that individuals like this, it's not the first time, have been in a position to kill. Remember Christopher Clunies all those years ago, and Jane Zito in her amazing campaign.
Emma Webber, who's Barnaby Webber's mother, has said that she believes that Rob Griffin, who is the Assistant Chief Constable of Nottinghamshire Police, has got blood on his hands and should resign. It's hard to disagree with that, isn't it? Well,
look, I think Mrs Webber has been incredibly dignified. Reading her account of her experiences and her husband's experiences, brought tears to all our eyes. Look, I think that accountability is important. I think that we need to explore precisely why it was that this set of circumstances happened, and also why it was that the families weren't told at an earlier stage about this issue of mental health. It seems that, and Mrs Webber's been clear about this, that it was a complete shock to them in November when this person is coming in for his plea hearing in the Crown Court, that the issue of diminished responsibility, which is the term in law for mental health defences, was raised for the first time. That amazed me, frankly.
Yeah. Do you know what? I'll ask you about that in just a minute, because obviously there has been the suggestion that he should have been tried for murder and put before a jury rather than being able to rely on that diminished responsibility defence. But just back to this police chief, and indeed Leicestershire Police have now faced questions about why they did not arrest Calocane on a number of occasions. So we've got 2 police forces here who haven't acted on a man who you've described as a killing machine. Surely heads need to roll. Otherwise, where is the accountability and the responsibility for these sorts of cases? Parents like me look at this case of Barnaby and Grace. You know, that could be any of our children.
Could be my kids.
Ian Coates. That could be anybody's granddad.
Yeah, exactly.
Surely responsibility needs to be taken, and I would suggest that Rob Griffin, if described by one of the victim's mothers as having blood on his hands, I know that sounds emotive, but she backed it up with a huge amount of evidence of how the police force had let them down in this case. Why shouldn't he have to resign?
Look, there are processes for this. My frustration with the IOPC, the Independent Police Complaints Authority, is that it does take a long time, and I think we need to make sure that any complaint, any issue of accountability is dealt with quickly, because this isn't just relevant for this horrendous case. It has wider implications.
Let's put it like this. Should he be considering his position?
Well, look, I think everybody concerned with the monitoring of this case needs to look at themselves and say, could I have done more? I'm not going to point a finger at individuals, but Mrs. Webber's...
in charge of that police force.
Mrs. Webber's points are very powerful, and I think we ignore them at our peril, because it could be you, it could be me in that position.
With regard to this diminished responsibility defence, I mean, clearly a doctor did say in court that he would not have committed these acts if he wasn't in the midst of a psychosis. I think we can look from the outside in. I wasn't in the court case. I wasn't following every day of the trial. But there is perhaps an argument, and I think the family's made this, that he seemed to have been premeditated in what he was doing, that he had a cache of weapons on him, that he was waiting in the shadows for some hours before he pounced in the middle of the night. That would therefore negate, one would imagine, a diminished responsibility defence. I mean, talking about him getting away with murder, that's because he wasn't tried for murder by a jury of 12 men and women, good and true, who could have made an analysis of whether he was mad, bad or both.
Yeah, look, I've been in these positions myself as a barrister, prosecuting and defending. You have to make difficult decisions based on the evidence. What I think has also, caused a little bit of a contradiction here is, of course, the pleas of guilty to attempted murder, which there's no defence of diminished...
the three victims who have been left with life-changing injuries.
There's no defence of diminished responsibility available for that. You need an intent to kill, and a murderous intent has to be proved. He admitted that, so you get that fully reflected there. But with regard to the diminished responsibility case, obviously the prosecution have to look at their evidence. There were, I think, in the end, 4 reports from experienced consultant psychiatrists, forensic psychiatrists, who came to the conclusion that there was enough evidence for diminished responsibility. I'm not going to get into the warp and woof of how these decisions are made or in this particular case, but there is no doubt that in cases like this, where you've got this limited defence available, it is very difficult for all of us, let alone the families, to come to terms with how this person had behaved, what he'd prepared to do, and then the outcome. And no amount of justice, no amount of the formal justice system will ever compensate for what happened here.
Although, obviously, the Attorney-General has now said that she is looking at the sentence, hasn't confirmed that she will refer it to the Court of Appeal judges. 3 judges could decide whether it's too lenient. Do you think she should refer it to the Court of Appeal?
I've been there many times, Camilla. I was Solicitor General for years, did hundreds of these cases, doing them myself in the Court of Appeal.
So yes or no in this case?
Look, I haven't seen the evidence. What I do know, there's one question I think that she will be looking at, is whether or not it was right for the judge just to impose a hospital order with a restriction rather than the option of sending the person to prison if he'd got better.
Because he could have done the hybrid order and he didn't.
Could have. The Section 45A.
As we see it now, this man is just going to remain in the hospital rather than ever be in a prison.
He does. The judge does address that in his remarks, to be fair to him. He does address it. So the attorney will have to look very carefully and judge this as a lawyer. She'll get advice from other senior lawyers and within 28 days come to a decision.
Would you be minded perhaps to ask the Attorney-General in the House of Commons a question about why the CPS pursued the manslaughter plea rather than a murder trial? Is that something you should ask the Attorney-General?
I certainly think that fullest explanation would be appropriate. I'm always conscious of the fact, as a politician, it's not for me to interfere in an independent process. And as a former law officer, I was very careful about how I approach things as a lawyer as opposed to a politician, because it is important that we get these things right based on the evidence.
Although questions to be answered, and there seem to be a significant amount, does once again point its way to a public inquiry into exactly what happened in this case. Starmer's called for that. Would you call for that too?
I certainly think that first of all, there's one thing that's happening now. The NHS have to order an independent inquiry. That's been done. So they've got to look at all the whys and wherefores of what happened with this man. If it appears that we're not getting sufficient depth and breadth to this, then I think having an inquiry with all the powers that brings would be extremely advantageous. What I don't want is some long-winded inquiry that will take years, by which time other people will have been put at risk and maybe other lives have lost. We know what the problems are here, Camilla. Law's been passed on this. This is all about making sure on the ground we implement the highest degree of monitoring in order to ensure the safety of the public.
Has care in the community failed? I mean, it seems oxymoronic to say that it's care in the community in this case. We know that the number of psychiatric care beds has been slashed from 52,000 back in 2001 to 24,000 now. I've anecdotally, because I wrote my column about this in the Telegraph yesterday, received quite a lot of correspondence from people saying the situation with care in the community is dire. People aren't being adequately monitored. Was it a mistake to close down all of those mental institutions?
I don't think we should go back to those days when we had those appalling institutions where we just lock people away and forget about them. And not just mental health people, but autistic people and disabled people. Horrific way to treat individuals. And you know I campaigned on that a lot.
I know.
However, I think if we move into a more community-based approach, which can be really good for many, many people who are on the spectrum and on that scale of mental health, we have to remember there will be a small but significant number who will continue to pose a danger.
Okay.
And that's why monitoring is so important. And just discharging into the community isn't good enough.
Quick question. Kemi's coming in a little later. Should she replace Rishi Sunak? Apparently a poll in the Sun on Sunday has suggested that she's got a better chance of winning the election than he has.
Oh, look, another change of leader? I don't think that would be the right thing to do. We've got a job of work to do, getting the economy right and sticking to the plan that Rishi Sunak has. That's what we should all do.
What if the plan isn't working, though, Robert? That's the trouble.
Well, look, let's not worry about the opinion points and look at the important indices, which are inflation and jobs and growth.
Fair enough. Thank you very much, Robert Buckland.